Hi, Sarah. You can go ahead and get started. Is Ron is Sarah? Okay, Sarah, do you hear me?
Yes, I do now.
Okay, you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, so I welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to bring to you a friend of mine, Ron Klutho, who's going to talk to us about refugee situation in St. Louis. Ron and I knew each other. We won't say when. We were both studying Russian. He was also studying Japanese. After school, he went off to Japan and taught English, and then he was back in St. Louis, helping Bosnian refugees and other refugees in this country. He learned Bosnian enough to travel there and visit. So he's very immersed in the refugee situation. He's going to talk about refugees from different countries, because we tend to focus on just what the latest urgent need is. But I think it's really good for us to get the big picture. He is Refugee Services Coordinator, and I'll let him finish anything else I should have included. Thanks, Ron.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Sarah and I went to SIUC Carbondale together too many years ago. I work at Bilingual International Assistance Services. We're an agency in St. Louis that assists immigrants and refugees from all over the world. And I'm going to give kind of I call it my Refugee 101 presentation, sort of the basics about refugee resettlement, where people come from, why, how, when. But then after all that preliminary stuff, I'm going to focus, hopefully I'll have time to focus on the situation today in St. Louis with Afghan refugees, because that's completely different from everything else I'm going to talk about. If you have a question during this first part of the presentation, if you don't mind writing it in the chat room, and then when I'm finished with this first part, then I'll answer as many as I can. And then after that, we'll talk specifically about Afghanistan. And I'm a technological idiot, so I hope I can make this work, but I'm going to start sharing my PowerPoint now. Let's see. Okay, good. Okay. There are 5, I guess you could call them legal definitions of people coming into another country, at least coming into this country. I'm going to speak about all 5 of these. I'm going to talk about the first 4 a little bit briefly, but I'm going to focus on the last one, refugee, because that's who my agency works with, and that's what I'm most familiar with. And I think that's what people are interested in. So I'm going to briefly talk about the first 4, and then I'll focus on refugees. So the first one will be immigrant. An immigrant is a person that has chosen to come to the United States of his own free will, and has the financial resources, the mental and linguistic preparation to come. Usually it's through school or marriage. They do not receive any type of assistance from the government. They're expected to just hit the ground running. There is, I'm not going to get into this, but there's a long wait for people that want to come as legal immigrants. There's years, and it usually comes through a sponsorship by a employer or a marriage or school, something like that. The next category I'll talk about is an asylum seeker. This is like a refugee, except a refugee has been able to prove his or her status as being in danger in his or her country before coming, whereas an asylum seeker comes here in some way, and then once he or she is here, has to prove to our authorities that it would be dangerous or fatal to go back to his country. And we'll talk a little bit later about how that's hard to prove. So, they're kind of in limbo until they can prove that their status as an asylum seeker, or hopefully an asylee. The next category I'll speak briefly about is undocumented immigrants. they're not, I said they're arrive in the country illegally. That's sometimes true, or sometimes they come legally and just overstay their visa. But the reason why these people are don't usually qualify for asylum or as refugees is because generally they come for economic reasons instead of political reasons or persecution based on their ethnicity or religion or whatever. So they're kind of under the radar. St. Louis, I'm in St. Louis. I don't know if Sarah mentioned that, but we have not seen a lot of this population until recently. My agency, in the last couple of years, we've been seeing a lot of people from, not a lot, but a growing number of people from Central American countries that are here, undocumented. And so, we help them as we can, but since they don't qualify for any type of assistance, it's really hard. They don't qualify to get a job either. So it's hard to help them. Another category which you may not be aware of is called a diversity lottery visa recipient. And it's literally like a lottery. People in countries that are not quote unquote refugee countries or asylee countries, basically every country in the world is given a certain number of slots each year. And they apply for this program, and if their name comes up, they receive a green card and a social security card, and they can come here, but they don't qualify for any type of assistance for 5 years. They don't qualify for any type of means tested assistance like food stamps or Medicaid. They're expected to just be self-sufficient. They often have relatives here who help them get started. But then the last category we'll talk about is refugees. And this is what I'm going to focus on the rest of my presentation on. And these are people that did not choose to leave their country. They were forced to leave because of, usually it's war, genocide, persecution, based on it's often religion, ethnicity, political beliefs. I'm going to talk step by step about the process too. I mentioned they usually wait in a refugee camp for a long time. And I'm going to trace the steps that need to be taken in order to come from their country to this country. They do receive a limited amount of assistance from the government, which I'll talk about in a little while, as opposed to the other categories that don't receive any type of assistance. This is the United Nations definition of refugees, people who have fled their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution. They do not want to or cannot return on pain of death, basically. And these are a couple of interesting ways to look at the differences between immigrants and refugees. I think I didn't make these up, but I think these are pretty apt to describe how the difference between these two categories. This is a slightly dated page, but this is fairly recent, and it shows the various categories that I've talked about. As you can see, well, the larger part of the pie, the light blue part, is immigrants, and that's the vast majority of people that come through marriage or school or job. The refugee slice of the pie is the dark blue, and that's quite small. As you can see, the white part is the diversity visa lottery, and the black part is asylees. These are, so I talked about people, asylum seekers are people that come here hoping to prove that they can't go back, and that the number that actually qualify to get asylum status is quite small. Okay. Now, in 2019, there were almost 80 million people who were displaced. That means they're not in their place of residence because of having had to flee. Not all of them are legally referred to as refugees. They have to be able to get to a neighboring country, often to a refugee camp that's set up there, and kind of register with authorities to be able to be called a refugee. And so from that 79.5 million, there were only about 26 million who were given refugee status, meaning they were able to prove that they couldn't go back to their country, generally in a neighboring country where they were given temporary status in a refugee camp. And then it's a waiting game until they can be resettled somewhere else. And that the last point I made there was the top 5 destination countries. Interestingly, Peru is number 2, and that was because of the situation in Venezuela, where millions of people have fled to neighboring countries because of basically people are starving there, from what I understand. Okay, I kind of mentioned this a little bit. When people are forced to flee, they generally go to a neighboring country. In the case of, for example, Bosnia, when that happened in the 90s, there were refugee camps set up in Croatia and Germany. In the case of Somalis, the refugee camps were set up in neighboring Kenya. When Syrians were fleeing their country, there were refugee camps set up in Jordan. So these are kind of hastily put together right on the border. People, when they get across the border, they can, stay there. I've got some pictures to show you of what these camps look like, but they're just sort of temporary housing until they can figure out what to do with them. I wanted to show, this is the upper left chart shows what parts of the world there are the most number of displaced people. Upper right is the 3 countries that, as of a couple of years ago, were producing the most number of refugees. These were the countries from which the most people had fled. The Afghanistan number is much higher now, obviously. And then at the bottom, those are the 5 countries that were not going to permanently house refugees, but these were the neighboring countries where people were temporarily staying in refugee camps. And you can probably guess what countries they're coming from. Jordan would have been Iraq and Syria. Ethiopia would be Somalia, and so on. And, I wanted to show you some pictures of some of the countries that people are fleeing. I think a lot of people assume that countries from which refugees have come are all, hellholes, or they're primitive, or they're jungles. But these are some pictures of places in the countries that we have refugees in St. Louis from. This is a small, medium-sized town in Bosnia called Travnik. I visited there about 20 years ago. Believe it or not, this is a beach in Somalia, outside of Mogadishu. This was in Syria, a shopping area in Damascus. Now, this is a kind of a before and after picture in the town of Aleppo, Syria, where we had a wave of refugees coming from Syria about 5 years ago, fleeing this stuff. Talk a little bit about the refugee camps. They're just, as I said, makeshift shelters. Families are given an allotment of food per month or week, and it's not like they're going to a cafeteria and having meals, but they're given bags of rice or beans or whatever, and they have to figure out how to cook it. They have to go out and find firewood, find water. These refugee camps are often, I mentioned they're set up in neighboring countries that don't necessarily welcome refugees in their country. So many times local people will cause trouble, steal from or attack the refugees in the camp. Sometimes they're in areas where there are wild animals, so that's also a threat. I've got some pictures of some typical refugee camps that people in St. Louis have come from. We had a wave of Burmese refugees also, and this is a picture of kind of where they were living in Thailand. The lower one was camp in Croatia from the 90s for Bosnian refugees. Now, these are both in Kenya, East Africa, and these are the largest refugee camps in the world. They're still being used. The upper left one, Kakuma, we have many Somalis here in St. Louis that were living in Kakuma camp. And it's not only Somalis, there are refugees from many African countries in these camps, and that also can lead to conflict, I guess you could say. Here's a couple of other pictures, and you can see the children are just sort of existing. Sometimes they try to have some kind of a makeshift school in these camps. Sometimes, well, many times there are people who happen to be teachers in their country and they want to do something to educate the kids with the hope and the thought that they would be at some point in a normal environment where they could continue their education and they don't want to lose out on the time. So volunteers will sometimes set up kind of makeshift schools. This guy was lucky that he had a blackboard and maybe one textbook, but they do what they could to try to keep the kids, give them something to do and educate them for the future. And I mentioned that they just will give families a certain amount of food per week, and this is the way it looks when they were handing out food rations. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty. And then they had to, as I said, collect water and firewood to cook the rice and the beans or whatever they get. So it's just kind of waiting until another country will take you. And so people from the United States and from Australia and other countries will go to these camps and kind of interview and screen people to ensure that they would not be a security risk and they are truly refugees. It's kind of hard to prove it because many times they fled with the clothes on their back, but that's the way it goes. This was in 2020. We had a total of about almost 12,000 refugees that came to the United States. Now, basically up until 9/11, 2001, we were taking about 120,000 refugees per year in the United States, but that went down after the 9/11 attacks because there was a lot more screening done and a lot more vetting. It went down to 10,000 or so. It's kind of ticking back up slowly, kind of ebbs and flows. We're on target to have a much larger amount coming in 2021 and 2022 because of the Afghan wave, which I'll talk about later. But you can see the countries that produced the most amount of refugees in 2020. I was surprised to see Ukraine on there. As far as I know, we don't have any Ukrainian refugees in St. Louis, but pretty much all the other ones we do. We do have a wave of Congolese refugees still coming into St. Louis, which are kind of overshadowed by the Afghans. But if I have time, I'll talk about the Congolese situation too. St. Louis is one of probably 50 or 60 refugee resettlement centers in the United States. And each of these agencies agrees to accept a certain amount of people per month based on capacity of housing availability, jobs, anchor families, that kind of thing. And we, in the 90s, when we were getting many Bosnian refugees, I'm sure you know that St. Louis has the largest Bosnian community in the world outside of Bosnia. We have about 80,000 Bosnians. We were getting probably 20 or 30 families per month, not only Bosnians, but mostly Bosnians in the 90s coming to St. Louis. Until this current wave of Afghans, St. Louis was getting maybe 20 people a month, not 20 families, but maybe 20 people a month. So it's kind of, it's ticking back up now. These are, I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but this is basically how people are screened or vetted before they're given refugee status. As much as can be done. This represents the places in the United States where we take refugees. Missouri is not on that chart as an individual place, but I think we are probably in the top 15 of states. Now, this is once people arrive here, having been sponsored by the International Institute of St. Louis, for example, this is what they receive. They you know, obviously they have to come here, so they have to repay their plane ticket to the U.S. just like a student loan. It has to, after 6 months or when they start working, they're expected to start making monthly payments on the plane ticket. And if you have a family of, you know, 6, 7, 8, as many of our families are, that can add up to a lot of money, thousands of dollars that people are you know, required to pay back. The resettlement agency will find an apartment and cover the utilities for a couple of months. They will provide very minimal household things. The only thing, I believe the International Institute is required to provide a new mattress for each person. But other than that, and they receive funding from the government and also from private donations. But other than the mattress, everything else they get is basically secondhand or used, dishes, furniture, things like that. They provide English classes, and they also provide job assistance for people. Now, you know, not all the great places that they live in are great. I've got a picture. This is an article in the Riverfront Times. It's a local weekly newspaper in St. Louis about, they focus on a Syrian family that came here about 5 years ago. And I mean, I don't know if you can tell that the lower right picture is the amount of bugs that they captured in that was 1 day's worth of bugs, little roaches and ants in the apartment they were living in. This was a pretty bad neighborhood where they were being housed, and it got a lot of negative publicity in St. Louis at that time. But this is a more typical, quote unquote, refugee apartment building. This is, I don't know, maybe some of you are familiar with St. Louis, but this is close to the intersection of Grand and Chippewa in South St. Louis. This is a multi-family apartment building, which the last time I checked was basically 100% refugee families. And they were from Nepal and Burma and Somalia and Afghanistan, many countries. This is just some more of the details about what each individual gets help with. In the early in the past, before 9/11, there was a lot more assistance given to families at the beginning, but right now they're kind of expected to kind of be self-sufficient pretty quickly. But you know, most of the people do kind of manage to get a job and struggle for a while, but they usually get on their feet. I think the Bosnian situation is a good example. I'm meeting some new refugees from Afghanistan who are kind of starting from zero, and I've been encouraging them that the Bosnians I met started in the same situation, and they're doing pretty well now for the most part. It's just a struggle at the beginning. And then a lot of people, including members of my family, question this, and I assure you that refugees do pay taxes. There there are rumors that refugees get free cars from the government and this and that, but they have to follow the same rules everybody else does. St. Louis was not really a refugee city per se until the 90s. Since we weren't so full of refugees, the United States had committed to taking a large number of Bosnian refugees, and St. Louis was selected as one of about 3 cities who would receive a large number. I think the other ones were Chicago and Des Moines, Iowa, maybe, because we were seen as a city that would be able to absorb a large number. And I hope we did a pretty good job. And so we kind of since then have been given other refugee waves from Somalia, Iraq, Syria, now Afghanistan. So, of course, language is an issue. We have, from the refugees that I've met, having worked with refugees here for 25 years, you meet everybody from literally brain surgeons to farmers that never went to school or held a pencil in their life, but they all have to get a job. So, English is the most important thing. If you were a professional in your country, there's a language barrier, but there's also different requirements for getting the job. They often take jobs just to get a job, just to support their family. I also used to teach English as a second language here. I was teaching English evening classes at the local community college, and most of my students were refugees who worked in factories all day, but they were hoping to, get a more professional job in the future. So I had a lot of, they would come to school exhausted from working all day, but I know of a number of my students who have gone on to become professionals. For example, I had one student from Bosnia who had been a high school principal. He was about 50 when he came, and he didn't speak much English. So he was working in a factory during the day, going to classes at night. He didn't become a principal, but he was able to become a high school teacher here, and he did that until he retired a couple of years ago. So it can be done, but it's requires a lot more intestinal fortitude that I think I have. They often come with a lot of physical health problems because having lived in a refugee camp or living in a war situation, they weren't able to take care of themselves, and this Medicaid that they receive as part of their refugee package usually is only about 8 months. They're expected to get a job with insurance quickly. Sometimes it takes 4 months to get the Medicaid card and another 4 months to get an appointment at a doctor's office, and by that time the Medicaid's over. So our caseworkers struggle to help people access medical care. And when they do get jobs, they often have jobs that don't, it's just hard. The premiums are high, the copays are high, so it's difficult. I've found this to be true. I think it's pretty interesting. A lot of people were in horrific situations, environments. They may have been wounded or physically injured, but it seems like their physical health was okay. They didn't get sick, but when they come here, they often got sick a lot, and it was almost like their bodies were, protecting. Their subconscious knew they couldn't afford to get sick, so they just didn't. And then once they're here, when they're kind of their guard is down, they did see a lot of physical health problems coming up. And of course, a lot of it is psychosomatic because, as you can imagine, many of our people have what we would call PTSD. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific countries and what people survived. But Dental care is also a big issue. That was obviously not a priority back home, but we have, that when I used to work at a church in St. Louis in the days of the Bosnians, and we were always asked to get help with dental problems. So we were always trying to find dentists who would do some pro bono work for us. So these are some of the issues that we face. My agency has, in addition to caseworkers that help people, we also have mental health therapists who work with people who are willing to access that help. And a lot of the people that we serve come from pretty traditional countries where you don't talk about mental health problems. So it took us a while to get people to agree to even try to access care. But although we could tell that they were struggling with nightmares and depression, these are some of the things we would see in the people that were in this situation. And they would just try to keep it private, keep it within the family. This is a chart of, it was a German study, but I think it applies here to refugees and what percentage of them experience certain things. And the white bars are for adults and the gray bars are for children. But all of these things, well over half witnessed violence, saw dead bodies. And so we try to keep these things in mind as we work with the people, that they've all, pretty much all, I would say at the very least, every refugee I've met has at the very least lost his or her home. It was often burned to the ground, but the majority of them lost family members to violence, and many of them were themselves physically or psychologically tortured. So when they're here, these things can be triggers. 4th of July is a difficult day. When they hear a siren, they might make them remember wartime situations, uniformed people. It was often people in control and power that were perpetrating the crimes. Like 9/11 for us is I guess you could say it's a triggering anniversary. There's a July 11th, for example, for Bosnians is an anniversary of a massacre that happened there in 1995, the worst massacre in Europe since World War II, in a town called Srebrenica. So we have a large amount of people from that who survived that here in St. Louis, and so that's kind of a difficult date. I kind of mentioned this. Some cultures think that there are supernatural forces that are creating these problems, and they don't like to share information with other people, even in the family, let alone outside the family, that maybe they would think it would bring dishonor. But with in the case of Bosnians, I keep talking about them because they're the largest community here. But when they came in the 90s, it was easy to find jobs here because the economy was good. And so a lot of them were working, and a lot of them were working 2 or 3 jobs just because they needed to support their family. And many of them were sending money to their relatives that were still in refugee camps or back in Bosnia. And they kind of were doing okay. But then when the economy took a downturn and a lot of people lost jobs, and they were out of that routine of working hard every day and coming home tired and going to sleep, when they're out of that routine, then that's when, for many of them, the memories would kind of come back, and the nightmares and all that stuff. So that's when we were able to offer therapy, and some people agreed to try it. We also contract with a psychiatrist at St. Louis University Hospital who was a former refugee from Eastern Europe. And obviously not everybody needs or wants that, but many of them who agreed to try it found that it helped, being able to talk about their problems that they were keeping inside, and also sometimes receiving some medicine, they felt better. And so I think the word spread in that community that it might be worth looking at. And we're still, some of the newer communities, we're still struggling with that. So many communities have their own ways of dealing with these type of memories and problems. And coffee and tea seem to be much more important in these cultures than it is for us, at least for me. I mean, for me, coffee is, I think a lot of people, I drink coffee in the morning so I don't have a headache. That's what it means to me. I don't really even like the taste, but it's just sort of a part of, it's an insignificant part of American life. But coffee for and tea for that matter, a lot of the Afghans drink tea, a lot of the Bosnians drink coffee. It is something that is a shared practice. I've had many people tell me they can't drink coffee or tea alone because it's a social thing. They just can't do it. You have to drink it with a friend because that sort of enables and produces conversation. You feel comfortable with the coffee or the tea, and it's something that every guest is offered. I drank so much tea yesterday visiting some Afghan families that that was too much. So also I showed you some pictures of what life may have been like before the conflict in some of these countries, some of those beautiful pictures of beaches and towns. And so they focus on the good life before the war, before the genocide, as a way of kind of dealing with situation now and kind of not focusing on the problems back home. Now, there are some family dynamic issues in most of these communities. I mentioned that they are pretty much all the populations that we work with are fairly traditional conservative societies where the man would be the breadwinner and the women would generally not work outside of the home. But now often both husband and wife work because they just need the income, and that it's difficult for some men to accept. By the same token, children were expected to be seen and not heard back home. And they, as you know, children learn other languages faster than adults do. And so they often will use that power to their advantage. They have to, we didn't have, in the 90s, St. Louis we weren't really prepared for a wave of refugees. We didn't have interpreters available. We didn't have mental health therapists available. Now we do, but in those early days, the children were called upon to interpret for, inappropriate situations like hospital visits or dealing with the police or other authorities. And it was just not healthy for kids to do that. But I know later they would kind of use their language ability to get what they wanted from their parents, threatening not to interpret or not to read the gas bill for mom and dad if they wouldn't buy them a video game or something. So that these things made it difficult for some men that their wives and children were kind of exhibiting equal power or it was difficult. Let's just say it was difficult for a lot of the men. Speaking about children in more detail, they would often go to urban schools where they kind of maybe had to get tough just to survive. So they would exhibit characteristics that the parents weren't really crazy about. They also, many times the parents, when they come here, they think, okay, I'm out of the danger zone. I'm out of the war. I'm in the United States. Everything is fine. I'm safe. But they didn't realized that the kids were being exposed to things at home and in schools that were not positive, and by the time they found out, it was too late. I'm on a task force, a Bosnian opioid task force, because we're dealing now after 20 years with a lot of Bosnian young people who are opioid users and other types of substance abuse, because the parents, this is an example, parents didn't know that the kids were getting into this stuff until it was too late. They honestly didn't even know that this was a thing here. Also, most of the parents would use sort of corporal punishment to discipline their children. I don't mean beating them, but I mean like hitting them with a belt or something like that. And so there have been cases where kids would come to school with a bruise or something, and then the authorities would be called in and parents would get in trouble. And so word spread that you can't hit your kids. And so many parents went to the other extreme and took a real hands-off approach, which also led to more, kids kind of going crazy and threatening to call the police if the parents wouldn't, buy them the video game or whatever, and tell them that the parents were hitting them. There was another case when I first started working with refugees. The first group I would work with was mostly Vietnamese. And there is a practice in Vietnamese culture. It's called coining in English, like a piece of money, a coin. And I believe it's along the same principles as acupuncture, where if somebody is ill or has a pain, a person would take a coin like a nickel and rub it on somewhere in the body, which is I don't really understand the principles, but it's like a power point place along the lines of acupuncture, which apparently works. And so, some kids would come to school with bruises from these coining experiences, and that became a big problem too for families. So, it's taken years for that all to play out, but I think parents gradually learn what they can and can't do here. Got two more slides, and then I think I'm gonna stop for questions, and then we'll talk about Afghanistan after that. It's kind of funny. This is how many Americans that I know see refugees. These are kind of the stereotypes, I guess you'd say. And then on the other hand, this is how a lot of refugees see us. And I don't know, some of them might have a grain of truth. Now, the next part of my presentation is I focus on about 8 or 10 countries that we work with here in St. Louis, kind of like the historical overview and what happened to produce refugees. But since we're kind of short on time, I think I will stop here, ask for questions, and then if there are no questions, I can talk about what's happening now in St. Louis with Afghans, because what's happening now is, everything I just said, throw that out the window, because what's happening now is a different ballgame. So let's see.
Great, Ron. It looks like there are a couple of questions in the chat. So let me go ahead and read you the first one.
Okay.
How is the housing of Afghans currently being processed in Europe and elsewhere and on military bases different from the camps you pictured?
Well, yeah, the situation with Afghanistan now, people were just removed quickly without having been vetted or screened. And I've gotten to know a number of families here that are this new wave, and they told me that one of the families was sent to the country of Qatar, and then Saudi Arabia, and then Germany, and then Mexico, and then a military base in New Mexico. I'm assuming that these are just regular military bases that are temporarily being used for this. I don't think this current situation is like the UN refugee camps that I showed pictures of. I think it's more, hopefully a little bit more pleasant. Maybe I'll stop there. I'm going to talk more about details about the Afghan situation in a minute, but any other questions? I hope I answered that question correctly.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is, does your agency do follow-up with the past refugees you dealt with? Do most do okay over time? So a two-parter.
Yes, as a matter of fact, my agency works with people that have kind of fallen through the cracks. The International Institute is the resettlement agency that works with people that are new, and they work with them for 6 months or so. But we tend to work with people that, for whatever reason, are struggling after 5, 10, 20 years. And yes, we do follow up with them. As I said, the majority of refugees seem to struggle for the first year or so, but then they kind of find their footing and they kind of move on. But we do work with people that have been here longer. And one of the things we also help with, I didn't mention this, is we have an immigration lawyer on our staff who helps people apply for citizenship. And I read somewhere that if we native-born Americans had to take the citizenship test, only about a third of us would pass. So it involves history and geography and civics. And so that's one of the things we help the people that have been here for a while with too.
Great, thank you. One more question. What language do most Afghans speak? They say, I ask because I would be interested in teaching ESL and thinking that it would be most effective if I knew at least a little of their language.
The two main languages are Pashto, P-A-S-H-T-O, and Dari, D-A-R-I. There are a number of other minority languages, but those are the two main languages that are spoken here. They're spoken there and also spoken among the refugees here. They're kind of related to each other. Many of them kind of speak both. I think Pashto is the official language. Dari is very close to Farsi, which is spoken in Iran.
Fascinating, thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have so far. So I guess if you want to go ahead and continue, if anybody has any questions while you're talking, they could go ahead and put them in the chat or Q&A, and you could answer them at the end.
Okay. I got involved, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago when we were told that we were going to pull out of Afghanistan. We have a number of Afghan people in St. Louis who were, they came under the SIV program. SIV means Special Immigrant Visa. And this refers to people who were interpreters for our military forces for the most part. People who kind of put themselves in danger when the Taliban would be taking over, because they were working with us, who would be the enemy, I guess, of the Taliban. So they were given, they worked for as long as they could until it became just too dangerous for them to stay there, as the Taliban were slowly gaining control. I didn't realize this, but I was told by some of the SIV guys here that you had to have worked as an interpreter for at least 2 years to qualify for that program. But many of them didn't work that long because of American budget cuts or other issues. And so if you worked as an interpreter for 10 years or 10 minutes, you would still be in jeopardy when the Taliban took over. So I was involved with efforts, in the spring of this year, up until August, really, to try to get in touch with elected officials, along with these Afghan friends of mine here in St. Louis, to try to, relax those rules and get more people out, as we saw that they were going to be, Taliban was gaining control day by day. My focus was on that because I assumed that Afghans who came to St. Louis they would be fine. They wouldn't need a lot of help, because you may have seen this on your local newscast too, about how the St. Louis community really came together and were making literally tons of donations to the International Institute, help things to provide for families when they arrived. So I thought, well, they'll be fine when they get here. So I was focused on these efforts to get people out, and I mean, that's another story, but unfortunately, it hasn't been smooth sailing when they come here. I mentioned that they were just had to, the focus was on getting these SIV interpreters and their families out, but there was such chaos at the airport in Kabul in August that a lot of people got out that maybe shouldn't have. And so a lot of the people that were our allies as interpreters are still stuck there and in danger. And I'm hearing about people that are there and kind of sleeping in a different house every night, kind of one step ahead of the Taliban who are targeting them. So, and that's another story. But anyway, once they got here, we had so many people coming here that we weren't prepared for them. And so we have about 50 families that are staying in hotels now until we can find a place for them to live. The International Institute had to lay off a lot of people before this because they weren't getting enough refugees in to warrant having a large staff. And so they're scrambling to hire people to do this again. So that's an issue too. And so I've gotten to know two families. I mentioned that my agency works with people that have been here longer. I've gotten to know kind of on the side, two families who are housed now, but when I met them, we were sitting on the floor in empty apartments. They didn't have anything yet. And they were, the one guy was a doctor in Afghanistan, and he was also an interpreter for the Americans. And he said his family got out on the last flight, literally with the clothes on their backs. And then the other family I met also got out quickly. He was a explosives, a detonation expert, and his family got out with the clothes on their back too. So the St. Louis is working hard to try to help as much as we can, but it's just a large influx that made it difficult to handle it. If any of you, I think Sarah mentioned to me that some of you were interested in helping or getting involved. I would recommend that there are a couple of organizations in St. Louis that have kind of grassroots organizations that have led the way and giving direct service to people and not bound by funding restrictions and everything. There's a group called Welcome Neighbor STL. They have a Facebook page. They're doing a lot of great work for welcoming new families. The other one is called Oasis International. And, they provide furniture and clothing. They even sometimes give cars to people when they get donations. They have English classes, they give driving lessons. So if anybody's interested, oh, thank you, Jennifer. If anybody's interested in, giving some direct service, I would say contact one or both of those organizations and see what I'm sure they could always use financial donations. This first wave of people that are coming now generally have some English because many of them were interpreters, and so they're kind of probably going to struggle, but they'll be okay. They'll be able to kind of navigate their way. The later ones that are going to be coming, we're going to be getting a lot more in St. Louis. They might not be have as much English and as much formal education, so that might be a little bit more of a struggle. We're being told that these camps in the United States, these military camps that are temporarily housing people, are closing on February 15th. So they all have to be out by then. So we're going to be getting a lot more here because there was such chaos in Afghanistan in August. They didn't go through the process that I described of refugee camps and everything. So as much as possible, this vetting and the screening is being done in the military camps here. But a lot of the people, when they arrive in St. Louis, are still not officially legally refugees. They're still kind of I think they're using the term humanitarian parole until they can get their final screening or vetting or stamp of approval, I guess. So that status is still kind of up in the air too. So it's going to be a long haul. Well, maybe it looks like it's about 1 o'clock. Maybe I'll stop there and see if there are any more questions. I can give, I emailed my PowerPoint presentation to Jennifer, and I told her she could send it to anybody else that would like to look at it more carefully and see the parts that I didn't have time for. But if there are any other questions now, I can try to answer them.
Looks like there's one in the chat. Is there much of a reception from the Afghans who live in St. Louis?
Yes, yes. I was meeting yesterday with a community leader who is very well organized. He's got volunteers set up to, do home visits to all of the families once they get into their apartments. I think they're going down to the hotels now and bringing the local Afghan community is preparing Afghan food at home at their own expense and taking it down to the hotels to feed people too, and just kind of encouraging them. But yes, very much so.
That's great. I don't see any other questions so far. If anybody has one, go ahead and put it in the chat real quick for Ron before okay, we do. How are these refugees being protected from COVID?
I believe they're vaccinated in the military camps before they come here. That's the standard, as far as I know.
Great. Sarah had to hop off for a moment, but she was on the phone and she says, "Thank you, Ron. I think many viewers will get friends to check out the recording." So the recording of this will be on the Carbondale Public Library's YouTube channel. It's also on our Facebook page, but it stays a little longer on YouTube. And again, I will put my email in the chat if anyone wants to get a copy of the PowerPoint. Just go ahead and email me and I will share that with you.
Very good.
Well, I think, one more question. I'm wondering if they're isolated and I'm interested in becoming more involved. I'm a retired CRNA. How can I help?
Well, these two agencies I mentioned have programs where they get American families or individuals to kind of adopt a new family and work with or kind of walk with them, helping them out, answering questions. I really think that that individual connection makes a big difference. I don't know if you're willing to come to St. Louis to do this, but if you contact one or both of those agencies and mention that, you heard me talk and that you'd like to volunteer, if you'd like, they could probably connect you with a family.
Great. And actually, we did a program last night through the library, and a few local organizations took Carbondale about refugee resettlement. And you can find that recording on the Carbondale Public Library's YouTube page as well. And there's some information about what people and organizations in Carbondale are trying to do to help. So that might be a little more local if you're in the Carbondale area. We did have another question. What about the use of Airbnb.org?
I think this organization, Welcome Neighbors St. Louis, they've reached out to a lot of landlords and property owners in the area to try to get housing. And I think that has come up. Airbnb, I think there were some that were, I think that did happen a couple times. But I think right now they're staying in the hotel kind of until the International Institute can I guess process them through their agency, and I think they want to be involved with putting them in housing, and the goal is to get semi-permanent housing. One of the problems is a lot of these families are fairly large, and so it's hard to find apartments that are big enough and inexpensive enough to host them. I think there's a family of 12 in one of the hotels. So that's an issue.
All right. I don't see any other questions, so I guess we will go ahead and wrap up for the day. Just want to thank you, Ron, for sharing this information with us. It was really interesting, and I think we all got a lot out of it. So really appreciate you coming and doing this.
My pleasure.
And I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you all so much for attending.
And it looks like Sarah put my email address in there, so feel free to contact me if anybody has any other questions.
Great.